Picture yourself in a forest. It is approximately 100,000 BC. You have not eaten in 3 days. The hunting was bad. The gathering was worse. And then, this morning, one of your group members died. Natural causes, no drama, just gone. And now you are standing there, looking at the body, and somewhere in the back of your very ancient, very hungry, very practical brain, a thought is forming that no one in your social circle has the vocabulary to discuss yet, because language is still mostly grunts and pointing. This is not a video about cannibalism, but it is mostly about something far more interesting than that. The moment when your species began to feel something about death that no other animal on the planet was feeling, and what that transition tells us about the specific kind of creature you are. And it starts with hunger, and ends somewhere you will not expect. Start with what the fossil record actually shows, because the evidence here is not speculative. It is written on bones, cut marks. The unmistakable signatures of stone tools scraping flesh from bone have been found on human remains dating back hundreds of thousands of years from sites across Europe, Africa, and the Americas. These are not the marks of animal scavenging. They are deliberate, precise, identical to the marks found on the bones of butchered animals at the same sites. The conclusion paleoanthropologists have reached is one that took decades of professional reluctance to fully accept. Early humans, under conditions of resource scarcity, consumed the bodies of the dead. And here is where it gets interesting, because not all of these cut marks tell the same story. Some of them tell a story of hunger. Pure, brutal, survival-driven consumption in environments where the alternative was starvation. This is what researchers call nutritive cannibalism. Dozens of species consume members of their own kind under conditions of extreme resource stress. For a species operating at the margins of survival in an unpredictable and often lethal environment, a dead body was a caloric resource. And caloric resources kept you alive long enough to have children. But something else is happening in the archaeological record. Something that cannot be explained by hunger alone. And this is the part that changes how you understand your own species. At sites like Krapina in Croatia, dating to approximately 130,000 years ago, researchers found the remains of at least 80 Neanderthal individuals, our closest evolutionary cousins, who coexisted with early Homo sapiens for tens of thousands of years, with cut marks and processing patterns that matched butchery. But there was something unusual about the Krapina findings. The bones had been carefully arranged after processing, which suggested that what happened at Krapina was not purely alimentary, it was ritualistic. The consumption and the ceremony were not opposites, they were intertwined. This is where the story of human death behavior gets genuinely strange. Anthropologist Tim White at UC Berkeley, whose work on early human remains has been foundational in understanding prehistoric behavior, and his colleagues discovered what they called mortuary practices, deliberate, patterned behaviors around the bodies of the dead that predate formal burial by tens of thousands of years. These practices varied enormously across populations and time periods. Some groups consumed the flesh and preserved the bones as objects of significance. Some defleshed the bones and then buried them separately. Some, as at sites in Papua New Guinea documented well into the 20th century, consumed the bodies of deceased relatives specifically as an act of grief and incorporation, a way of keeping the dead within the living community rather than losing them entirely to the earth. Sit with that for a moment, because it reframes everything. The consumption of the dead was not, in many of these cases, a failure of moral imagination. It was an expression of one, a specific, culturally elaborated response to a problem that only creatures with a theory of mind actually face. The problem of the permanent absence of someone who mattered. No other animal grieves the way humans grieve. No other animal has the cognitive capacity to understand that the absence of a specific individual is permanent, that the person who was there yesterday will not be there tomorrow, or ever. This understanding, which psychologists call a theory of death, requires the same cognitive architecture as a theory of mind. The ability to model another being's internal states, to understand that other beings have continuous existence, and therefore to register their permanent cessation as something meaningful, something that demands a response. The emergence of ritualized behavior around the dead is, in the archaeological record, one of the clearest signals that something cognitively unprecedented was happening inside the human skull. It appears in the same period as art, as symbolic thinking, as the use of ochre for decoration, as evidence of language. These are not coincidences. They are expressions of the same underlying cognitive revolution, the emergence of a brain capable of meaning-making, capable of asking not just what happened, but what it means that it happened. And meaning-making around death took many forms. Mortuary cannibalism was one of them. But so was something that appeared at roughly the same time and tells a different and equally important story: intentional burial. The earliest unambiguous evidence of intentional burial dates to approximately 100,000 years ago, at sites like Qafzeh Cave in Israel and Skhul Cave on Mount Carmel, where early Homo sapiens were found buried with grave goods, objects placed deliberately in the grave including shells, red ochre, and animal bones. These were not accidental burials. They were deliberate acts of placement, of arrangement, of the recognition that something needed to be done with this body beyond simply leaving it or consuming it, something that marked the transition, something that acknowledged the significance of what had been lost. What is remarkable is that mortuary cannibalism and intentional burial were not mutually exclusive. They coexisted. In some populations and time periods, both practices appear in the archaeological record simultaneously, which suggests that early humans were not operating with a single universal answer to the question of what death required. They were experimenting, developing culturally specific responses to a universal problem, finding different ways to answer the same question that had never needed answering before their cognitive revolution made it unavoidable. The question was this: what do you do when someone who mattered stops existing? No animal before the cognitive revolution faced this question. The fish does not miss the other fish. The insect does not arrange its dead. The question only arises when the brain becomes complex enough to model the continued existence of others, and therefore to register with genuine cognitive weight when that existence ends. Your ancestors ate the dead not only because they were hungry, but many of them also ate the dead because they were grieving. Because eating was, in the cosmology of certain early human cultures, a form of preservation, a way of keeping the person inside the group, a way of refusing the finality of death by incorporating it into the living. It was, in its own terms, an act of love, executed with stone tools, in a forest, by creatures who had not yet invented the word for love, but who were already feeling something that required a response more elaborate than simply moving on. This is what makes the archaeological record of early human death behavior so quietly extraordinary. It is not a record of savagery. It is a record of the first attempts to answer a question that philosophy and religion have been wrestling with ever since. What does a life mean? What do we owe the dead? What is the right way to respond to the permanent loss of someone who mattered? The answers your ancestors arrived at were varied, but the fact that they were asking the question at all, that they were developing culturally specific, patterned, deliberate responses to death rather than simply leaving the bodies where they fell, is the evidence that something had changed. Something had emerged in the architecture of the human mind that made death a problem requiring a solution rather than a fact requiring nothing. The funeral you might one day have, the flowers, the silence, the careful choreography of grief, is the direct descendant of a Neanderthal at Krapina 130,000 years ago, carefully arranging bones after a meal. These are not opposites on a moral spectrum, they are points on a continuum. The continuum of a species learning, for the first time in the history of life on Earth, that some things deserve more than to simply be forgotten. Your ancestors ate the dead, and in doing so, some of them were doing the most human thing that had ever been done: refusing to let go.